Welcome to this evening's webinar. Tonight we're funded by the University Innovation Fund from the Scottish Funding Council, and we are looking at finishing lambs. So the 2023 crop of lambs have had quite a lot of challenge through the year. And we're just really holding this webinar with Lorna Shaw, who's a nutritionist, Fiona Crowden, one of our veterinary investigation officers, really to try and go forward from this point for lambs that have had challenge through the season, that we can take them forward and market them when we are hoping to market them. Here is just some of the challenges that they have come across this year. Think like 2023 from lambing time, we had that very slow start to spring. Then we had an unbelievable amount of grass, and then it got very, very wet. And it has all just been a perfect storm for both internal and external parasites. So a lot of producers are finding a huge amount more worms and such like at different times of year from what they would normally find them as well. We've also had a pretty tricky harvest. It was wet and it stayed wet, and the kind of quality of some of the inputs that people have are maybe not as good as they would have been in the normal times. Then, of course, weather. We've had everything. I don't think there's anything that hasn't been thrown at us over this last 6 months. So if we think about like where we are with lambs, we've got a few hard facts on the here. The UK flock is decreasing. It has decreased by 4% compared to 2022. So there is less lambs out there. When we have less lambs, we tend to have a better price because there's this balance between your supply and demand. If we look at the female breeding flock, it's back 2.4%. So the UK flock is including everything at census. So that is your lambs, your lambs for breeding, whereas just the pure breeding flock is back 2.4%. If we look at what was happening with store sales before Christmas, there was a lot less forward in 2023 compared to 2022. And the DEFRA survey was showing us that there was 1 million less lambs on the ground, which is a huge amount of lambs to be out of the national flock. Again, thinking of December 2023 compared to 2022, store lambs were up about £10 a head at the market, and there was 12% less of them forward. We also had the best start to the year in 2024 that we have had in the last 10 years. And you see the graph there, that's store prices, and that's just showing over the different period from July through to December. You've got 2023 in the green, you've got your 5-year average in dots there. So I'm comparing 22 to 23. So 22 is the light blue, whereas 2021 is the dark green that's on the top. So you can kind of see where we are, but while we have a decreasing flock, the value of these lambs could really potentially be quite good going forward. So all these things to think about as we're talking about how we take them forward. Thinking about the marketing and the timing of marketing them as well, we've got some key religious festivals that are always good to keep an eye on. Easter, 31st of March, that should be 2024. And then we've got Ramadan, and that is happening at the same time as Easter. So it starts on the 10th of March, generally runs for about a month. So that's going to be happening at the same time as Easter. If we look at the blue kind of dotted line there, that is when Ramadan was last year. And you can barely see the spike. So 2023 is the green, and you see the demand for lamb really, really rising there. So that's some really key dates to keep in mind, and especially for the hogs and any early season lambs. Now, Easter, we all know very well, whereas the other festivals, Ramadan and the EID festivals, they're Muslim festivals, so you might not know them just quite as well. And here's just a few facts. 60% of Muslims eat sheep meat every week, whereas we, as a general population, Only 6% of us eat sheep meat every week. Muslims in the UK spend about £30 a week on sheep meat. Our general population is £12 per week on all meat. And there we have 2011 compared to 2021, population of Muslims within the UK is growing quite vastly. So when I give you these dates and thinking of what is coming in March and these lambs that we're speaking about for the rest of the evening, this is something really, really to keep in mind, I would say. So first up, we're going to have Fiona, and then we're going to move over to Lorna. We have got usual Zoom function where we've got a chat box and we've got a Q&A box. Everybody can see what you put in chat. Q&A, it is only the three of us that can see what you're putting in there. So please, if you've got any questions, pop them into either of the two boxes and we will try and address them as we go on through the evening. So Fiona, I am going to stop sharing and let you share your screen as I introduce you. So Fiona is one of the veterinary investigation officers that is based up here in the northeast. She is in Aberdeen, and Fiona has the unfortunate job of having to work with dead things, don't you, Fiona? But she has loads of photos to show of her dead things. So Fiona, I will hand over to yourself.
Thanks so much, Kirsten. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. As per introduction, I'm one of the vets that works in Aberdeen. If you're of a sensitive disposition, you probably want to listen to my talk rather than watch some of the slides that I've got in here. But we're really thinking from a veterinary point of view and from a disease point of view, what disease challenges are going to come for these lambs in the next 3 months. And this has certainly the potential to be a bit of a depressing topic. I seem to have lost my ability to move forward. Excuse me 2 seconds so I can sort my thing out. There we go. Has the possibility to be a bit grim. But if we think about it, is if we can identify the risks that are posed to our lambs, if we can plan some mitigation, some risk assessment, how are we going to manage these risks, then hopefully we're going to decrease the losses and the potential losses. It's always a good idea to keep an idea and an eye on what's going on and keep some records, and that lets you review and plan for the next year. But if we're thinking about the overwintering disease risks, this is a review of all the recorded causes of ill thrift and death in post-weaning lambs in Scotland from September through to March. So these are your overwintered lambs, basically. So we can see, without doubt, the biggest challenge, even in an average year, to these lambs is gastrointestinal worms. They are prevalent. This year's a particularly big challenge, and they are certainly top of the list in most cases, even, be that death or ill thrift. Now the risk period for some of these is kind of over. So pasteurellosis, acute fluke, pulpy kidney, the main risk period for those are over. And we're going to cover and touch on really what's going to risk and what the biggest risks are for those lambs that we've got on the ground now, looking forward for the next 3 months. So I said worms were the biggest risk, and we're going to start with them. Gastrointestinal worms. If you're getting deaths, then things are fairly serious. When they do happen, they tend to happen to really thin lambs. So there's been a period where these lambs have had a worm burden, they've not been digesting or absorbing their food properly, and they've really lost condition. And you can see that lamb in that photo. You can almost see how thin it is. You can see that it's lost muscle mass. And while it's grown reasonably at one point, it's then lost the condition that it had. Other slight clues we've got, if we do have a bit of a skittery bum there, there's some dags around the back end of it. And if you look really carefully, there's a bit of a edema underneath the bottle jaw, underneath the jaw there, just suggesting it was so low in protein because of the worms that it has developed some fluid under there. And we usually associate that with fluke, but worms are certainly a cause of that as well. There's a wee picture of the worms in a little worm wash. They are incredibly small, really not visible to the naked eye. And it's amazing to me that something that small causes such devastation and financial losses to our lambs. Down the bottom, we've got some intestines of a lamb with worms. You can see there's very little fat around. Those intestines that are usually quite chunky and juicy have gone all thin, and the content is just watery. On the right-hand side of that picture, there's a kind of big, what looks like a fluid-filled sock. That is the colon, that's a large intestine. That should be this consistency of like reasonable porridge. So you can imagine this lamb's absorbing nothing and it's losing any nutrition that's going in, is just coming straight out again. So where do we go with risks? Why has it been such a bad year this year? And when you're thinking about the risks to pasture burns, we've really almost got to go back a whole year. So depending on how badly burdened the pastures with larvae at the back end of the previous year, if we get a mild winter like we had last year, we don't get the losses of the larvae in the pasture, and more larvae will overwinter on pastures to be ready for the spring. We then get your lambing ewes and their periparturient rise. They increase their egg output around lambing from just before till about 6 weeks after lambing, and they are going to add larvae to your pasture. And then we get, in a normal year, we get the ewes and lambs, and the lambs have quite significant egg outputs. They haven't got immunity in place, and so these worms output a lot of eggs onto the pasture. Now, those eggs on the pasture are effectively locked into the pat until water happens, until rain happens and washes them out onto the pasture. So we need warm weather to develop them from eggs into larvae, and then we need regular rain to wash them out onto the pasture. And we saw that this year. From July onwards, it rained every 2-3 days, and it was just an absolute perfect storm for these worms, completing their life cycles really quickly and getting back onto the grass and getting eaten and round and around and around. And so pasture burdens have been really, really high. And we've seen really serious issues in the PM room with worms this year. And then we haven't really had, particularly until the last few days, we haven't had cold weather to knock down the burdens particularly quickly. And so a lot of pastures are still carrying reasonable burdens of worms that maybe wouldn't have been quite so bad. So if you've got a pasture that's was lambed on, has had ewes and lambs at foot on it over the summer months, that's going to be a reasonably risky pasture, even into these winter months. The other thing that's contributing to high larval burdens on the pasture is wormer resistance. And I think this year a lot of farmers have been more aware that they've got resistant problems because the burdens have been that much higher. And the wormers just aren't working as well as they used to. So how are we going to think about managing these problems for these lambs going forward? Risk assess your grazing. How risky is it? How likely is it for these lambs to have ongoing worm burdens? Did I give them a wormer? When did I last give them a wormer? And how sure am I that that wormer actually worked? And we can check wormer efficacy, so we can check whether it's worked. There's a little bit of preparing for sustainable farming funding. Speak to your vets and they can guide you through that, but there's a little bit of funding for checking wormer efficacy as well. Really regularly handle, condition score your lambs any chance you get to lay hands on the lambs. Take a wee minute just to look at them. Are they looking a bit thinner? Is there a little just trace of scour at their back ends? You know, how are they looking compared to how they looked a week ago or a month ago? And DAG score, how dirty they are at the back ends, can be a really useful way of assessing worm burdens and just getting an idea and a feel for where they're there. Worm egg counts definitely have their place, but just be aware that if you've got lambs that are kind of skittering through the eye of a needle, really, really loose diarrhea, if you're collecting feces for a worm egg count, you're not going to collect that from the pasture. You're probably going to struggle to collect that if you've gathered them onto concrete, And these lambs, generally, even if you're going as far as to collect it directly from rectums, it's really hard to get enough sample to be useful. So just put that into context. If you're seeing signs of scarab, even your worm egg counts look okay, put them into context and interpret them with care, and have a wee chat over with your vet if you're not sure. And the last thing is just to investigate your losses and your poor condition. So one really useful thing you can do is you lift that unfortunate dead sheep from the pasture into the back of the truck. Actually take the minute to see what information you can get from it. How heavy is that lamb? Is it light as a feather? Is it much lighter than it should be? Can you feel its bones? Has it lost muscle mass? Is this a skinny lamb? So if it is, well, okay, what's at risk for the rest? Should we be, well, probably gathering them in, having a little bit of feel? Is this just a lamb that's missed a dose or spot it out? Or actually, is this a reflection of the tip of the iceberg of poor condition in the rest of the group? So take a wee moment if with those dead lambs just to take a bit of a notice and what information they can give you. So fluke's always a big concern for a lot of farmers out there, especially dead lambs this time of year. Is it acute fluke? And we are getting just to kind of the crossover month where we go from what's considered acute fluke to what's considered chronic fluke, but it's a bit of a continuum if we're honest. So this is a picture of acute fluke. That's a normal liver on the right. It's a fluky liver on the left. You can see there's a bit of blood pooling above it. There's a blood clot below it, and the actual liver itself is pale and it's got these kind of bloody tracts through it. Now, little baby fluke migrate from the intestine through the abdominal cavity and then make their way through the tissues of the liver. They've got really spiky bodies, and they use these spiky bodies to move through the tissues, but that causes damage, and that damage then causes bleeding, and that's what kills your lambs with acute fluke. You can even see this lamb's not in terrible condition either. There's a bit of fat down the bottom of that photo. So that has killed it from acute fluke without necessarily losing much condition. But if you've got a nice fresh carcass, it's reasonably easy to see that that's what's killed it. And then as we move into chronic fluke, kind of this time of year onwards, the fluke have made it into the bile ducts of the liver. They're sitting there producing lots and lots and lots of eggs. And irritating the bile ducts. And so the bile ducts get thicker. And so you see these kind of thickened white rings of the bile ducts on cut surface when you've got chronic fluke in the liver. And that's what your slaughterhouse is commenting on most of the time when it says kind of signs of fluke. So what's fluke doing this year? It really depends on how fluky the pastures have been. If you've had a high burden of fluke, if you've got a really fluky pasture, it's been fluky year on year on year. It probably still is fluky this year, but it's not a high risk year for fluke. I think what happened is we had an exceptionally dry June, and the wee mud snails that the fluke needs to complete its life cycle, their populations didn't increase until well later in the year, which means the fluke contamination, the levels of miracidia on the pasture really haven't got going terribly much this year. And we're seeing very little fluke. I think we've seen one, perhaps two cases of acute fluke through the PM rooms so far this year. And we keep a wee eye on the blood samples and the feces samples that are coming through. Again, really low rates of fluke. So there are some places that have got fluke. They tend to be the very fluky places that always have fluke. Apart from that, we're really not seeing much fluke this year at all. If you're concerned, blood samples are a really useful way because they can pick up fluke just after infection, 2 to 3 weeks after infection, when the fluke are still migrating around the abdomen. If you're going for fecal sampling, those fluke have to have made it into the bile ducts before we can detect it, because the bile goes into the intestinal content that goes into the feces. So it's not until they're kind of 8, 9, 10 weeks post-infection that we're going to see signs of fluke on the fecal samples. So if you're looking for acute, you want to prevent acute fluke earlier in the year, blood samples are the way to go. Fecal sampling probably coming into its own just kind of from now onwards, really. So moving on from the parasites, because I'm going to talk for too long. Pneumonia, pasteurellosis. Actually, the peak pneumonia for Pasteurella pneumonia really April to June, but we do see ongoing losses through the winter. Tends to be in already slightly debilitated lambs for other reasons. They're dealing with kind of heavy worm burdens or cobalt deficiency, something else going on, tend to get struck down with Pasteurella. But I mention it because of mycoplasma pneumonia. Now, it's really common, especially in housed lambs, and it's responsible for that kind of soft cough you quite often get in lambs in a shed. But the lungs have a very similar appearance. But mycoplasma really has no impact on growth rate, no production limitation. It just hangs around, causing this small amount of consolidation that you can see in that bottom picture. And the reason I mention it is that I really struggle. There's a little bit of difference in those pictures, but in the flesh, it's really, really, really hard to tell the difference between a mycoplasma pneumonia and a Pasteurella pneumonia. And this is important because if we hook out those lungs and go, oh, it's Pasteurella, that's what's killed it, and it's actually mycoplasma that's caused the change, that lamb's died of something else. And we need to go and find out what that something else is for the benefit of the rest of the group. So don't just glance at lungs, assume that's a Pasteurella pneumonia and move on. If your vets want to do some further testing on lungs, I encourage you to say yes to them because you need to know whether this is Pasteurella, whether it's something else that's killing your lambs. Prevention of Pasteurella pneumonia, most of your lambs are hopefully had two Pasteurella containing vaccinations, so your Hepivac P, your Ovivac P, and Ovipast. Ideally 2 vaccinations 4 to 6 weeks apart. Make sure you store and administer your vaccines as per data sheet. So moving on, ruminal acidosis, and we do see it again, tickles on right the way through, providing a bit of a challenge and deaths in animals right the way through till March, and while they're being fed kind of concentrate feeds. From the post-mortem point of view, it's not usually a desperately hard diagnosis to make. There's usually a decent amount of grain or carbohydrate food, high carbohydrate food in the rumen, and that starts to ferment rather than being digested. You get production of lactic acid. That lactic acid gets into the bloodstream, changes the pH of the bloodstream, and kills them pretty quick. When we look at the risks, quite often see it kind of earlier on in the year with lambs being popped onto stubble fields instead of grazing the grass around the edges like we expect them to. There's always a few that decide that moseying over the rest of the field, picking up all the grains that have gone over the back of the harvester is a much better use of their time. And a few of them always manage to kind of topple themselves doing that. When we think about it from a concentrate point of view, we want to introduce your concentrates reasonably slowly if you can. If you're feeding in troughs, then definitely feed them slowly. It's a little bit more difficult if you've got hoppers. But if you are feeding concentrates and grain concentrates in hoppers, if you can manage to not introduce them to hungry lambs, if you've got a good amount of forage in the field already, something else in long fibre in their stomachs, just to offset the intake, then that is really what we want to do. And just a wee word of warning, if you're doing concentrate grain mixes, which is not uncommon, the concentrates quite often have antacids rather in them, but it's enough antacid to offset the carbohydrate in that concentrate. If you then mix it with grain, you don't expect the antacid in the concentrate to offset the acidosis potential of the grains there. And again, we quite often see problems with people kind of mixing the two, expecting it to be okay because there's antacid in the concentrate, and finding out that it's perhaps not. Listeriosis, a bit of a challenge. There's a bit of mouldy silage going around. Quite often think of listeriosis as a brain problem. We get the kind of the droopy half side of the face. We get the sheep that propulsively walk and then end up in fences and corners because they're compulsively walking forward. So that's the classical way we think about listeriosis, but actually we can get what's called enteric listeriosis as well, and that's what the picture on the right is. That's the stomach of a lamb, and it looks pretty thick and pretty awful down the bottom there. Now that bit there is meant to be about as thick as the top, and that thickening and inflammation is being caused by listeria. Obviously has killed this lamb. Can cause just scour, and this was a group of ewe lambs, and about 20% of them were scouring, and there was a kind of about a 5% loss. So just to be aware that you know, scouring lambs aren't always worms, and also that your listeria isn't always neurological signs. It can be scour as well, and that can be fatal. Obviously, mouldy, spoiled silage, but actually decaying foodstuffs, woody debris, that all seems to be quite happy places for listerias to live and grow. And soil contaminated feed. We had a lot of wet weather trying to make silage, so it's more likely that our silages are going to be potentially soil contaminated this year. And the bacterial numbers are highest in the silage around the mouldy part rather than the actual mouldy part. So it's just important that if you are pulling out the mouldy bits of a bale, to generously remove that from around the mouldy areas, rather than just removing the obviously mouldy bit. And if something looks like the bale below, if at all possible, try not to feed it. I'm moving on because I'm aware that I'm running short of time. Cobalt deficiencies, again, most of them have been picked up by now. Most sheep that are cobalt deficient, they poorly grown, ill-thriven, starey coats, open coats, tend to get a bit of scour because they're secondary. They get secondary burdens of parasites. But you can also get what they call white liver disease in secondary to cobalt deficiency, and these sheep end up with neurological signs. So can look a little bit like listeriosis. So if they're thin with neurological signs, cobalt deficiency certainly crops up as a possibility. And there you can see a wee map of Scotland, the areas that are at high risk for being low in cobalt. And it's at higher risk, particular pastures that are well drained or have had lime applied to them and become a little bit more at risk. The good news is reasonably easy to diagnose, especially on blood samples. We need a reasonable number of blood samples because sometimes it can vary quite a lot within a group and we don't want to miss a deficiency. I've got 10 there, 6 at a very, very minimum. If you're worried about it, we can look at liver analysis, and you can also get your herbage analysed as well. Various methods of supplementation. Have a quick chat to a vet or advisor, and they'll keep you right as to what the most cost effective is for lambs. Copper toxicity is much more common than copper deficiency because we're very good at giving them copper. But the liver stores the copper, and sometimes it just can't cope anymore. And that copper spills out into the bloodstream. It breaks down the blood cells in the bloodstream, and these sheep die of what's called a hemolytic anemia. They die of these blood cells being broken down. So that leads to very, very yellow carcasses. We get a bronze coloured liver, we get black kidneys, and they get what's called port wine urine, although I wouldn't particularly advise drinking it. So it's not a pleasant way to die, and can cause reasonably significant losses. There are particular breeds that are more susceptible. That's not to say that the other breeds can't get copper toxicity, but those breeds that I've listed there are more susceptible. Growing lambs are more susceptible than adult sheep. So our overwintered lambs that have been on concentrate for a while, we don't want to be giving them too much extra copper. And it's quite often some stressor, so bad weather or handling or moving, that just tips the liver from coping with how much copper it's got to a crisis. Now it's important because to mention that while blood copper is really, really good for detecting deficiency, it's really, really bad for detecting near toxicity. Because it's stored in the liver, it's really, really closely controlled by the body in the bloodstream. And so these lambs that are just about to die of copper toxicity will have pretty normal blood coppers, and even at the point of death it'll have risen, but it'll only have been high for a few days before death. So liver copper is a good way of checking it, but blood copper is not really. Risk-wise, cattle concentrate obviously is pretty high in copper. We don't want to be doing that. But also long-term feeding of copper-containing ration. We've definitely seen that. And that tends to be pedigree animals or pet lambs that tend to succumb from that point of view. There's quite often multiple sources of copper supplementation in the history of anything that's died of copper poisoning, or indeed pig or poultry manure. They get fed really, really high copper diets, and they lose a lot of that copper in their feces, and so therefore in the manure, if it's been applied to the grass, that can be a problem. And distillery byproducts tend to pick up copper from the copper stills. If you do have copper poisoning, it's a food safety issue. If you're suspicious that that's what's going on, I'd suggest that you don't put anything into the food chain until food safety have been advised and have risk assessed everything, just because it's far easier not to do that than to run the risk of a big food safety investigation after things have gone to slaughter. And I'm nearly done, I promise. Scab, scab diagnoses go up in the winter of scab. We tend to see them peaks September to April, and scab can really reduce the growth rates of sheep and have a big impact of some overwintered lambs, especially if they're purchased lambs, purchased from multiple sources. It tends to be a month or two until the infection really gets going in a group. And actually, for the first 4 or 6 weeks after infection, you may not see any clinical signs of scab at all. You get this lag phase between the kind of the first infection of the mites and them getting into sufficient numbers to start causing clinical signs. And those are little scab mites. I don't know if you can see them on that right hand picture. Those teeny tiny wee white dots are the actual scab mites. They're faintly visible to the naked eye. They look like little grains of sand, but if you take a photo and look at it, they become a bit more visible. So obviously, risks or contact with the infected sheep will fence lines, these sorts of things, and as I said, purchased from multiple sources. The good news is we do have a blood sample. Now, this can be used to screen incoming animals if you feel you need to. That's probably not the case just now, but might be useful to know for future. And it's also really useful for differentiating scab from lice in itchy lambs. So it's about £9 per sheep to do it. And if you are screening them and meet the requirements, there's some sustainable farming funding available for screening for scab as well. If you do get a diagnosis of scab, I'd really like to implore you to plunge dip as a treatment. There are mites that are starting to get very resistant to the injectables. And what we're finding more and more often is using the injectables knocks back the population but doesn't eradicate it as we hope, and the scab comes back 4 or 5 months later as the numbers get going again. So if you can, plunge dip for scab rather than using the injectables. And the last thing that we do see through the PM room occasionally in kind of reasonable sized outbreaks are dosing gun injuries. The back of a lamb's mouth is just as soft and squishy as yours and sensitive as yours. And if you've got dosing guns that have got rough edges or you're particularly pushed for time and things get a bit kind of short tempered and rough, there can be injuries enough to cause the death of lambs. And there can be injuries bad enough that they may recover, but it's been pretty sore to eat for a number of weeks, and they've lost some condition following some rough handling. And you can see that lamb's got a good amount of bruising and abscess formation underneath its chin. And this one here had just the end of a dosing gun obviously pushed into the soft tissues beside its tongue. That one eroded through a blood vessel, and that lamb bled to death. It's not a nice way to die, particularly. So, on that cheery note, I've mentioned a lot about post-mortem examinations. I think they're a really useful tool. It's a really comprehensive tool in looking into the causes of deaths and ill thrifts, and unless we know what's killing your lambs, what's holding them back disease-wise, we might never, you don't know how to make it better for the rest of them. So they are very useful. They're not overly expensive if you live near a post-mortem centre and can submit them directly to us. Sheep-wise, it's about £60 for a single animal. If you're unfortunate enough to have up to 4 animals that are suitable for submission, it's a flat rate of 105 for those 4 animals, and that includes all diagnostic testing. That's the examination and all diagnostic testing. The only thing we pop on top of that is some disposal costs. We'll give you a report within 24 hours. And the final diagnosis sometimes takes 1 to 2 weeks. That's generally because we're doing further testing just to confirm what we initially suspect. Things like the stereosis take a wee bit longer just because we've got to wait for culture and things. But yeah, so that is me. Apologies for overrunning a little bit and talking too much. If you've got any questions, if you want to pop them in the chat or the Q&A, we'll do our best to come back to them.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Fiona. Well done for doing as many ailments in such a small point of time. And your photos are fantastic. They're really, really good, really bring it to life. So thank you for that. There has been a few questions. We will maybe keep questions to the end, but just while Lorna's loading up her screen, one to fire at you, Fiona, is what is the most common thing you're seeing just now coming on to the PM room?
Worms.
Worms.
Still
Still
worms.
now
It's
in January.
still worms. Yeah, we're still getting good numbers of lambs ill thrift and deaths because of worms. Yeah,
That hits it home fine, doesn't
does it
it?
just? Yeah, it's just been such an awful year for them.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Fiona. We will come back to you with all these questions that are coming in. Next, we're going to go to Lorna Shaw. So Lorna Shaw is a SEC ruminant nutritionist, and Lorna is based out of our Perth office. So Lorna is especially keen on sheep, and she's a great person to speak to us tonight about how to go about finishing these medium to late finishing lambs through the year. So Lorna, I will hand over to yourself.
Thanks, Kirsten. Sorry, I'll clear my throat quickly. Yeah, so tonight I'm looking at kind of finishing those medium to late finish lambs. So trying to kind of make the most of what difficult conditions we've seen this year. Obviously, we've had a bit of a challenge in terms of both silage and cereal harvests, and that's meant we've got a kind of lot more home-based cereal on the market. So I'll be looking at balancing those types of rations and also looking at some overwintering options such as brassica and beet crops as well, or root crops, sorry. So yeah, hopefully lots more photos of live lambs during this section, and we're trying to optimize performance to try and avoid Fiona's table, as lovely as Fiona is. So just to start, I wanted to look at some of this data from AHDB. So this is data looking at the number of tonnes of compound feed produced in the UK. And the data looks through all different classes of stock, but one thing to really note from it is the dramatic change in compounds for growing and finishing lamb. And we've seen quite big drops in compounds for growing and finishing lambs. So there's been a change of about 8% from November 22 to November 23. And there's been a drop of around almost 16% in the period July to November 22 to 23. So we can see that there's been a really large drop in lamb compound production. So this is kind of telling us a couple of stories. Obviously, we've got Kirsten's first story that our lamb numbers are down a wee bit, and looking at numbers of lambs slaughtered, that's about 1.9% decrease on the year. So that was the same period, July to November. But we're also seeing some other patterns emerging as well. If we look back to May, June this year, we had a really, really dry period where grass kind of stopped. This was peak lactation for ewes, so right when the lamb's really reliant on the ewe for nutrition. So whether that's had an effect, but then that was followed by quite a wet but mild summer, which meant that we got really good grass growth this year. So there could be an aspect of a bit less lamb creep going in early as well into these figures. The other thing is we've had quite a difficult harvest. So we've had a lot of rejected grain on the market, and whether this has had an impact also into the number of bought in compounds. But it's quite interesting reading. We need to look a bit more into it, but we're definitely starting to see a pattern in how we feed our lambs. Another factor might be an increase of brassica and root crops also. So just to kind of start off, this table looks at the nutritional requirements of finishing lambs. So I've looked at lambs from a live weight of about 30 to 40 kilos. Our finishing period officially starts when that lamb hits about 35. So a lamb sitting at 30 will still be in its kind of late growth period. But looking at our ME and MP requirements, so that is the usable energy and protein by the lamb, we can see that a 35 kilo lamb requires about 12.3 megajoules a day. To put that into context, 12.3 megajoules a day is roughly the same as maintenance for an 80 kilo ewe. So we can see that they're on a really, really high plane of nutrition at this stage. If we're needing lambs to put on 300 to 350 grams a day, so those kind of medium keep lambs that we're trying to get away as soon as possible at the moment, we're needing those ME requirements to almost double. When we're looking at double, this is the same 21.6 megajoules of energy is actually similar to a twin bearing ewe 1 week before pregnancy. So we can see they're on a really, really high plane of nutrition. When we look at dry matter intakes as well, a 40 kilogram lamb will eat about 1.6 kilos dry matter a day. So a 70 kilo ewe in mid to late pregnancy will also eat about 1.6 kilograms dry matter a day. So we can see that their nutritional needs are really, really high, and we need to ensure that the diet meets this. We have had a lot of wet weather recently, and when we've got either lambs grazing at the moment on grazing with concentrate or maybe some additional forage, or out wintering, those requirements for maintenance actually increase about 15%. So when the maintenance requirements increase 15%, we've got a lot less available for any additional growth rate. And that's why we tend to see growth rates drop quite a lot when it's wet. It also affects the dry matter intake quite dramatically, and we'll tend to find they have to eat more just to meet the same requirements as they did when we're seeing a drier spell. So it's really important to keep this in mind when we're looking at rations for lambs. So looking into how forage qualities look this year, and it probably comes as no surprise to anyone that forage is extremely variable. So this is silages that have been through our lab between July to January this year. And we can see that the variation in dry matter has went from 13.8%, which would actually be rejected into the lab, right up to about 74.6% dry matter. So at 74.6, that would actually be almost classed as hay. Hay hits about 80. Haylage sits about 60% dry matter. So we can see that there is a vast majority in our dry matter, and that will really affect the fresh weight intake that that lamb requires. ME as well is telling us a similar story. We're going from about 8 megajoules right up to 12.3, and our average is 10.4. One thing to note in my next couple of slides, you'll learn that 10.4 is actually below the minimum we need to finish lambs if we're looking at a forage-based diet. So we're really needing as good a quality forage for lambs as we can possibly get our hands on. Protein as well is a vast variation. 5.4 is particularly low. In fact, it's lower than quite a lot of hay samples we'll see. And we're going right up to 18%. So we'll either see 18% in a really high clover sward, or alternatively, sometimes it might mean that there's a bit of additional nitrogen still on the crop as well at that level. So we need to kind of be careful about where that extra proteins came from when it gets that high. But ideally, we want it as high as possible. The more protein we can get from forage, the less we need to supplement and the less cost going into finishing that lamb. Fibre is equally important as well, especially when we're coming to feeding lambs on concentrate. Fibre is king. And SIP is a really good indication about how well the lambs will intake that silage. So that can affect about how much of the ration of silage we can put safely in. So things to consider if we are on a grass forage based finishing system and to optimize lambs at this stage at the moment is to actually know what your forage quality is, get it analysed, know what you're feeding, and try and feed the best silage you can possibly manage. We need to ensure that there's a minimum of 40% dry matter from forage in the ration if we're feeding concentrates alongside it as well. We need to really make sure that they've got enough functional long fibre in that ration to use it efficiently and avoid acidosis issues. We also must ensure that the target ME is above 10.5 and as close to 12 as we can possibly achieve. I appreciate 12 doesn't come to everyone. but as good a quality forage as possible. There's some really, really good research by Tim Keady in Ireland, which Kirsten may share in the chat as well, which showed that a silage around 70 DMD shouldn't really be fed without additional concentrates. We really need to make sure that we're feeding as good a forage as possible to optimize weight gain. In terms of crude protein, in finishing, we're targeting about 12 to 14% crude protein on a dry matter basis. It's really important that protein needs are met, especially when we're looking at things like high worm challenges at the moment. Ensuring the protein and energy status of the lamb is already met, the lambs are thriving, will go a long way to make sure that those lambs are ready for the challenge that's coming ahead to them. And yet, just another note that poorer forages will always benefit from supplementation. So if we didn't have forage analysed and we fed our typical ration for a 35 kilo lamb eating about 4% of body weight. So if we were feeding a silage that was 30% dry matter, it had 11 crude protein, but we had a 9 ME silage versus 11 ME silage. The lamb would typically eat about 3 kilos a day out of a 30% dry matter forage, providing it's okay. It will vary slightly depending on the energy intake. So this is more of an option, well, more of a look at if you didn't know what forage quality was already. I think we'd maybe tailor this a bit closer if we did know. And they're eating about half a kilo's concentrate. The predicted weight gain from a 9 ME silage is about 150 grams a day. If we compare that to feeding exactly the same, so the ration looks no different, but the silage is 11 ME, we can see we can get 190 grams a day out of that ration. So that changes the time to finish by 10 days for those lambs. 10 days for lambs eating silage and concentrate means 10 less days having to look the lambs, 10 less days you're having to house them, bed them. If you have got them outside, it might be diesel costs. There is definitely cost to keeping those lambs. So if we can optimize finish just by getting silage as good as possible, it'll really pay dividends. And it never costs any more to make good silage versus bad silage typically. So it's worth looking at it. Again, with preparing for sustainable farming funding, there is funding to look at your soil quality to optimize forage quality, and it's probably worth doing to try and get silage right for this year coming. So moving on to cereal-based finishing systems. As this combine really highlights, we had a really difficult harvest this year. It was wet, we saw a lot of lodged crops, there was a lot of grain fallen, so yields were affected slightly. We also saw secondary growth, which meant we had uneven ripening of the crop. We saw a lot more rejections when it came to malting barleys and seed barley. So we had poor germinations, high skinnings, some kind of spindly grains. We had really dry grain, really wet grain. So we've got a really variable quality grain, but high rejections means high amount available for feed, which is good. It's brought the price down a lot. So it's probably quite tempting to feed a cereal-based ration over a concentrate in some cases, if that option is available to you on farm. But it's really important that these rations are balanced to avoid C and acidosis risks that we saw on Fiona's PM table earlier. So looking at cereal-based finishing rations, there's a number of options. I won't go too much of it. Fiona highlighted it quite nicely, but we need to ensure that there's a minimum of 12 to 13% of the diet from long fibre. So if we are inside, ideally straw. Outside, a really good quality silage may be applicable, but we really need to make sure it's quite high NDF. Applicably, a kind of drier silage will suit better than a wetter one. In this case, we really need to make sure there's plenty of functional fibre. If we're really worried about functional fibre, the other thing to do would be to add an inclusion of beet pulp or soya hulls, so another fibre source into the mix. And that's usually about a 10% inclusion we'd recommend. We also need to make sure the concentrate mix is balanced. So it should be about 14 to 15% crude protein on the fresh weight, and then that's mixed with straw will meet protein requirements and meet those MP requirements for that finishing lamb. So I've put 2 example rations in there. We've got an untreated grain and a treated grain. Obviously, the other option especially for finishing lambs, and if we're doing an ad lib cereal-based finishing system, is to use an enzyme and urea-based treatment. So that will up protein by about 30% and also increase pH. There is sometimes a slight benefit of adding another additional source of protein just to kind of meet DUP needs. It's not quite as important in finishing as it will be in growing. But that is kind of an option to balance the ration a bit further as well. So there could be little tweaks we could make depending on system there as well. But the key thing to note from this is our expected weight gains on an ad lib cereal-based finishing system should be about 250 to 300 grams plus a day, providing we've got everything balanced as well as possible. A 40 kilogram lamb on this system should be capable of eating usually about 1.5 kilos of concentrate if we've got straw as the only forage. If we're outside and we've also got additional forage, it might be a bit lower, looking at about 1 kilo a day, depending on what other forage we've got in front of them, how much grazing, etc. So I talked about little spindly grains and dry and getting processing right, and it was something that Fiona mentioned as well, was processing grains. This is really, really important when we're feeding home mixed cereal rations, is that we're getting grain processing right. Lambs are quite efficient at digesting whole grain. So we've got the photo on the left here of whole barley, which lambs can quite efficiently use. The only cereal that lambs probably won't digest as efficiently is maize, because maize has a really waxy cuticle. They find it really hard to break down. On the other, I'm going to shift to the left first before I go into the middle. But the left actually shows a barley that's been quite heavily processed. So one thing to find out if your barley's heavily processed is to actually put your boot in it. If your boot comes out white, it's you've probably went too far with the processing. But we don't want it shattered, and we can often find it shattered if the grain's too dry, or we've got the roller set too hard, tight, or we've simply got quite spindly grains as well. We might struggle to process them properly. So the one on the left was actually a case that I was out at, and we did see rumen acidosis issues in lambs on that grain. So the grain in the middle was the next batch that farm made after rumen acidosis, and water was added. And this was actually treated grain, but if we are treating bruising untreated grain, sometimes adding a bit of water can just help improve that rolling quality. And we can see that we just want a kind of light roll. So we want the grain to be pretty much intact with a crack, ideally, if we are processing grain. So either whole or middle, avoid the left. So just kind of summary of that, cereal processing, keep it to a minimum, light crack. Feed management, we want to always ensure hoppers are kept full, clean and dry. If hoppers get empty, we can find that lambs will flood them, then we get issues with smothering. We also can get issues with lambs gorging, and then you just find dead lambs at the end of the hopper. So we need to make sure they're always kept full. Clean and dry as well. If feed gets wet, lambs won't eat as much. We find weight gain will start to drop. We want to ensure fibre, and there's sufficient fibre in the ration to slow down the passage of the grain in the rumen and stop any sudden drops in pH. So that can be either beet pulp, hulls, sometimes an addition of oats can help, or making sure we've got sufficient fibre from forage. So either straw if we're indoors, or plenty good quality silage hay, or if we do have sufficient grazing. We really need to make sure there's plenty, though. If there's not sufficient grazing, we can see issues. We can add a rumen buffer, such as Fiona mentioned, so something like 2% of sodium bicarbonate, so that works out about 20 grams per day, or if the lamb's eating about 1 kilo a day, or we can add a commercial buffer also to balance rumen pH, and also make sure there's plenty of clean free running water. It's always important that lambs get enough water, and we can't just rely on crops for water either. We need to make sure that there's sufficient running water in all situations for lambs. A good thing to always remember is that the rumen's a cargo ship, not a speedboat. It doesn't move fast. It takes about 2 to 3 weeks for the rumen to fully adapt to a different diet, so we need to introduce it slowly. Fiona had really, really good guidance, and it's exactly what I'd recommend. So I'm not going to repeat it over and over again, but just take a couple of weeks, introduce the ration gradually, make sure lambs are full, and just be careful. And it can be a really rewarding system at the same time, as long as it's done properly. But we just need to make sure we're keeping that balance right. There's a lot of microbes in the rumen, and they all need to be kept happy for the lamb to be efficient. Another issue that we sometimes see with cereal-fed lambs is urinary calculi. So it's common in male lambs fed high levels of concentrates, and it's otherwise known as gravel. Main things to remember for this is mineralization. An intensive lamb diet should always include a mineral, including about 0.5% of ammonium chloride, so 5,000 ppm. Ideally, we want to include cobalt, vitamin E, selenium, and we should also have iodine on that list, which are really, really important for growth. So making sure that those trace elements are met is really important also. Water, we should always make sure that there's enough clean water. I've mentioned it already. One thing that can help with that is rock salt. That's also provides a wee bit of minerals to them as well, but providing rock salt will just help to keep them drink and keep everything diluting and prevent calculi buildup. And we can also look at the calcium phosphorus ratio in the rations. So we want to maintain that about a ratio of 2:1 to prevent urinary calculi. So it's another consideration to make when we're cereal finishing lambs. So looking at the last system I'm going to cover tonight, we have our outwintering systems. So I've focused on rape, kale hybrids, kale and Swedes for the sake of tonight. There is other options such as fodder turnips are sometimes still, well, stubble turnips are sometimes still about at this time of year. And then we also have fodder beet, but we tend to find lambs don't perform quite as well on fodder beet as they will kind of hybrids, kale or Swedes, unless they're also supplemented. So for the sake of tonight, we're just going to focus on these three. Looking at them, they've got very, very low levels of dry matter, so we can imagine these are all quite bulky feeds. Lambs are requiring to eat quite a lot to get the same out compared to what they would a cereal-based ration or even a silage-based ration. If we look at a lot of silages at 30% dry matter, we're looking over double what we are for a kale rape hybrid, which is our highest dry matter we're looking at on the screen at the moment. In terms of ME, our hybrids and our kale are about 10.5 ME, so about the same energy as an average silage, but a lot more protein, so quite high in protein. So we're not needing to supplement protein as much for them, but we might need an additional source of energy just to keep them balanced. And then for Swedes, we're looking at quite a high energy but lower protein crop. So we need to make sure that protein needs are really met when we're grazing Swedes. Some things to consider if we are like feeding root or brassica based rations is to make sure we're assessing stock before grazing. So we want to pull any leaner animals out and manage them separately. So put them either on more of a conventional forage based ration or a concentrate ration. So they'll be your really long keep lambs, but you just want to make sure every lamb's getting a chance and reduce that competition. We don't want anything kind of going off, so you really need to keep a close eye on them. You should always offer long forage. Typically a hay or a really good quality silage, when they've got a lot of nice root or brassica crop in front of them, straw's not going to be that palatable unless they're really, really looking for that fibre. So quite a palatable forage is advisable. And we typically advise probably about 30 to 40% of the dry matter is provided from that long forage. It's always good to remember that the brassica is essentially a concentrate feed. It's like feeding barley, and the same risks come along with it. We also want to watch mineral supplementation when we're feeding brassica crops, especially iodine. It's a goitrogen, so it's a glucosinolate, so it can cause goitrogens, which can lock up iodine, and it's also deficient in iodine itself. So that's one of the major ones, but typically just making sure all your trace elements, so your iodine, cobalt, and selenium are all met efficiently. Ideally, to maximise utilisation and control intakes, strip grazing is advisable and aiming to move about every 3 to 4 days. And that way we can calculate how much of the crop we're needing for the number of lambs and make sure that we're maximising utilisation, and also it may allow us to provide a better space for a dry lie, and also shelter if at all possible. If we are in a really, really open, windy, dark, wet field, providing some like straw bales to allow for shelter can really help with welfare and also optimize weight gain. We should really be looking at clipping bellies before grazing, simply to keep them clean. Lambs really do benefit from that dry lie, keeping clean. They don't like the cold and wet. We'll all be aware of that. Monitoring performance is also key. Your weigh crate is your best friend. We need to be looking at lambs as regularly as possible to make sure that they're performing on any system, whether we are looking at preserved forage, whether we're looking at grazing and supplementing with forage and concentrate, whether we're looking at ad lib concentrate or our root and brassica crops. We need to monitor performance as closely as possible. And we can expect weight gains of around up to 200 grams a day, so usually between kind of 200 to 250 grams a day. So just looking at an intake, so I've looked at kale here. We've got 100 lambs grazing kale with a 35 kilogram average weight. We'd expect those 100 lambs to eat about 650 kilograms of fresh weight of kale per day, so about 6.5 kilos per head, and about 50 kilos of hay if we're providing a hay alongside, so about 0.5 kilos per head. And our expected time to finish on that, up to 42 kilos, is about 35 days at 200 grams a day. So it's worth looking at what yield the crop has had and calculating your moves and your allowance. The Outwintering Strategies Guide is also available online, so it gives a really good tool if you are outwintering lambs, just to look at your, it also gives all the calculations to calculate your requirements and your yield as well. So last but not least, I want to just include a couple of pictures of troubleshooting that we'll all probably be quite aware of. And there's a wee picture of a weigh crate in the top corner. I just really want to stress, it is your best friend. Please monitor them as closely as possible. Housing as well, we want to ensure there's sufficient space. So the DEFRA guidelines for space above, so at the stage they are now, I think is about 0.75 meters squared, between 0.75 and 0.9 meters squared per lamb. So we need to ensure there's sufficient space. Bedding's kept clean and dry. We've got sufficient running water. I mean, we all know what the weather's been like the last few days. The picture on the bottom left is probably really, really familiar to many of you. But we need to make sure there's clean running water, and this is where we can start seeing issues, is when we get this rough typical weather. So try to make sure that water's available and make sure we have fresh feed available in these situations will pay dividends. Got the photo on the top left here, ring feeders. I think they're the thing that everybody loves to hate. We all need them. We'd all be lost about them without them, but we just need to make sure that if we are feeding ring feeders, that we are kind of making sure we've got enough ring feeders for the number of stock in the field. So usually I think it's got about 20 spaces for use round a ring feeder, but we want to make sure that that is available, and we're trying to reduce waste as much as possible as well. You can see the ring feeder in the picture there is going up the middle. With lambs, that'll be even worse. So keeping the forage as even as possible and accessible as possible is really important. And then we've got also looking at feed space for troughs or hoppers. So I think the advisable amount for ad lib feeding is between 10 to 15 centimetres a day. If we are trough feeding concentrates, it's about 30 centimetres a day per lamb, 30 centimetre space per lamb. Our hoppers come in all different shapes and sizes, so just check the hopper you're feeding. How many feed spaces does it have? If the hopper's emptying really quickly, it's a surefire way of telling you you've not got a big enough hopper and we're needing to put more in that field to make sure that it's kept full all the time. So it's just about monitoring, performing, and making sure things are as well balanced as possible. So that's me. I think I've don't know if I went too far over, but thank you very much for listening. And if there's anything I've missed or any questions, I appreciate I only had 20 minutes. Please don't hesitate to email or give me a ring.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Lorna. Loads and loads of good tips there. Oodles and oodles of tips. I particularly liked if your boot is white, then they're over processed, something that's nice and easy to remember. So thank you for that. There has been oodles of questions coming in, and just to let you get a drink of water, Lorna, we will go to Fiona. Go to Fiona first, and just work our way through these. The first one that came in was about rotational grazing, and I know it's a funny one for this time of year, but it would have gone with your theme of worms, Fiona.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in a rotational grazing, how long would you leave it before you re-enter when lambs, yows come out to try and break the cycle?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. So the answer is not a useful one, which is about a year. So you're probably looking for a really good long, a break of 3 weeks, 3 months is probably still not going to do it, depending on the weather in between times. But if you're thinking about rotational grazing in the summer, that gap's there isn't a gap. You will bump into things. But if you're running a rotational system, if you've got a longer sward length, they're grazing above the kind of soil interface where most of the larvae are. So they'll be at a slightly lower risk of picking up quite so many larvae. And if you've got a leader follower, and the sheep are eating the very, very tips, again, they're less likely. The larvae don't like being up at the top of the sward because they get dried out and they get exposed to UV light, which kills them. So they tend to stay down the bottom. So depending on how you're doing your rotational grazing, if you're keeping the lambs eating the tips of the grass, they'll get exposed to less worms anyway. But yeah, with rain they migrate up the sward. But yeah, the answer to that is not a useful one, which is
I guess it's following the risk as well, isn't it, Fiona? What happened in that field the year before? Has there been cattle? Has it been silage? There's many a different thing there.
Yeah. Equally, I've seen farmers get caught out with silage as well. So they've kind of lambed on a park, put it to silage, and then it kind of put their weaned lambs on it, thinking post silage should be pretty clean. And it's carried a chunky burden of larvae over from those yows and lambs at foot. And 3-4 weeks later, skittering dead lambs. And that's not uncommon to hear that sort of story. So yeah, just be really careful. They can hang around for a while, especially when it is reasonably moist, like it was this year.
Okay. There was another question. I'm just going to stick with you, Fiona. There's another question about lambs with dirty bums. And in this scenario, the people have moved them off of grass onto Brussels sprouts and now back onto grass and haylage, and the lambs have started skittering. What should they do?
Skittery lambs, worms until proven otherwise. I'd be taking some fecal samples and checking a worm egg count. I think would be the very first thing I could do. I know I said that was challenging. Just interpret with care, interpret with alongside your vet. But that would be my suspicion. When was the last time you wormed them? How dirty was that pasture? Could it have been kind of dirty-ish pasture that they've been picking up burden of worms right the way through until now? Have they been picking it up? Did your last wormer work? So did you give them something that didn't work and they've not been cleaned out as much as you thought they would be? Other causes of scour, obviously dietary change. It might have been that dietary change that's kicked them off. Cobalt deficiency. So certainly if your worm egg count but comes back confidently low, and I suppose if again they mentioned that they were planning to handle them, let's condition score them. Let's put your hands on them. If a good number of these lambs are thin, there's a cause for concern there. And yeah, probably worms, could be something else. Definitely something that needs addressed.
And Fiona, while you're on deficiencies, I'm going to stick with deficiencies. And you spoke about copper. And there is somebody asking about copper in that how do you decide when it's safe or not to do it? So they typically aren't bolusing with copper. But how do you know if it's safe or not to do it?
It's a bit challenging in that you can't tell, unless you go analysing livers, you can't tell how much copper is in a sheep. However, they're moderately resistant to copper deficiency. So unless you're in a really copper deficient area with known copper deficiency, they'll probably be okay. And if you're worried that they are copper deficient, take a blood sample and check to see if they're copper deficient. And if they're not, you're fine. So I think copper's is why I talked about toxicity rather than deficiency. Is we're very, very good at giving copper, and we're quite almost too good. And toxicity is way, way, way more common than deficiency. So if you don't need to supplement it, don't. If you think you might need to, check they're deficient first.
And we've obviously got our continentals being high risk as well. You would tend to, I guess, advise not to add copper boluses for your continentals.
Yeah, I'd just be really careful. I think, as I say, we're very good at giving it, and just because people talk about it a lot doesn't mean they're right in doing it. I mean, worst case, not even worst case scenario. Worst case scenario, you give them copper toxicity, but you might just be wasting your money. You might not be getting any benefit from that copper supplementation, if the lambs are not deficient.
Yeah. Okay, Lorna, I'm coming to you now. And this was actually a question that was posted when Fiona was speaking, but I think it's probably more relevant to you. And while we're still on elements and deficiency, it just fits in perfect. But somebody who has had iodine deficiency and it's slowed down the growth rate of their lambs, and they're wondering how can they go about preventing it?
So I think there's a number of things to think about. It depends when you're starting to see your iodine deficiency. It might not actually technically be the lambs initially, it could be the ewes. So make sure that ewes iodine status is good, especially pre-lambing. There's a lot of passive transfer during the pregnancy process, so making sure we're meeting ewe requirements is really important. If we're starting to see kind of, it's quite common in young lambs, if you're slightly starting to see some stillborns and stuff, we can see that there's an obvious iodine deficiency there. If we're starting to see it in older lambs once they're grazing, if we know there's a known iodine deficiency, just get to them as soon as possible, making sure we're supplementing. So probably in younger lambs, drenching carefully to avoid the issues we saw in Fiona's presentation, or a bolus once they're old enough, just to make sure we're covering that before we're starting to see any issues. Obviously, brassica crops are a known risk, so we really need to be careful there. If we can't bolus or drench, can use mineral buckets or lick tubs, but we've got to be careful that you can lead a duck to water, but you can't make it swim. So we need to, it doesn't mean that every single lamb is going to take what we need them to take. So we need to just be careful with that.
There's a tremendous balance as well, though, isn't there, Lorna, that you don't actually over supplement them as well, then end up in toxicity problems too.
Yeah, we've been doing quite a few mineral reviews with a few clients, and it's quite surprising how much over supplementation we've got, especially for sheep. I think sheep farmers are probably some of the best of it. We've got blocks out there, we've got drenches, we've got boluses, we've got concentrate feed that's already mineralized. Some people are doing home mixes and mineralizing. Some people are buying in protein supplements that are double mineralized and adding them in. There's a lot of different sources of mineral to start with. So it's worth stepping back and just, looking what's all going in the ration and making sure that we're meeting requirements, but the rest, if we're not seeing toxicity, as Fiona said before, we're putting it down the drain. We're just wasting money.
And Fiona spoke about listeriosis, Lorna. How high is the risk if we think about all the different forages? So if we think about silage, haylage, hay, straw, do they all carry a risk, or is it just, we always think about it with silage, don't we?
Yeah, so your main ones that carry a risk will be silages and haylages. Haylage is a really interesting one, actually, because haylage sits about 60% dry matter. So it's not dry enough to be a hay and completely preserve itself, but it's not wet enough to be a full silage and preserve itself with lactic acid. and the bacterias that are used up. So we're still got that kind of sugar element. So it's sitting in the middle. It's kind of still moist. It's still a breeding ground. So we can get, it's probably quite a higher risk for molds when we look at a haylage, especially if we've got one that's not been wrapped efficiently and not consolidated enough. For silages, ash is a really good look at kind of whether we've got a high risk. So typically we flag anything above 80, but your real risk area is if we're about 90 megajoules of milligrams of ash in the sample. I interestingly looked at all the silage samples going through our lab, so every single one, and found about 6.9% of samples through our lab last year were all above 90. So that really high risk zone. I think it was about 15 or 16% that were above 80 in that kind of hairy area. So there is quite a high level that come through as a risk. We just need to be careful about it, thinking about cutting height. And yeah, what else might be the old molehill story?
Interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Final question is for Fiona, and somebody was asking about what happens when they have unfortunate deaths on a Friday or at the weekend when the PM rooms are closed. How do they keep their samples fresh to submit on a Monday?
So summer, bit challenging. Everything goes off really quickly in the summer. But this time of year, actually, things can be remarkably fresh just with the cold ambient temperatures. Especially if the dead animal isn't that fat, and even if they are that fat, they can keep reasonably well. So this time of year, I'd give it a risk. I'd give it a punt on the Monday. And if you go in there and go, look, if it's rotten, just chuck it in the bin and don't charge me. I think we'd be okay with that. And if we can get some information out of it, then we'll get some information that could be useful. So I think this time of year, I would take a chance. If you're not that far away from the PM centre, just run it in and see what they say.
And if it's a small animal, say it's a lamb, when it's a bit warmer, hopefully in April, May time, what about freezing it over the weekend?
Yeah, don't freeze things. So keep them chilled. I'd say in the fridge, but not the food fridge, please. Please, especially not abortion material. But yeah, if you keep them somewhere cool, in bags, so that scavengers don't get it, so things they don't get scavenged. Likes of aborted fetuses or dead lambs, they keep dead fresh for like 3-4 days. So if you're getting a tickle of an abortion problem and you're not sure whether it is going to be something or not something, pop them into a bag, keep them somewhere cool. And if it becomes a thing in a few days' time, you've then got more material to hand into us, and we're far more likely to get a diagnosis. The more material you give us, especially with abortions, the more likely we are to get to the bottom of it.
And the important thing with abortions, if they happen, is trying to get the placenta to you as well, isn't it?
Yeah, placenta is really important. If you want to diagnose enzootic abortion, we tend to need the placenta. So if that's a particular concern, placenta is key.
Brilliant. Super. Oh, well, we have had a huge amount of information this evening from the two of you, so thank you very, very much. Folks, we are going to be starting a series looking at the 2024 LambCrop in a couple of weeks' time, starting on the 8th of February and then every Thursday night for 3 weeks, where our topic to start off with is going to be increasing flock output, and then we're going to look at reducing flock input, where we'll look at grass and then labour. So first up, we're going to have Kathy Dwyer and Tim Keady speaking to us, and we're really going to focus on triplets, so triplet management, behaviour, and maximising the lambs that are reared. And in a year like this, when we're hearing of a lot of big scans, hopefully it'll be a good topic to get you ready for lambing time. So thank you for joining us this evening, and we hope to see you all on the 8th. Thanks now.